At a family gathering about transfer of inheritance, my parents shocked me by giving their entire estate to my sister and told me to work harder, but then Grandpa stood up and handed me a $2 million check, and what happened next was just catastrophic. I arrived at my parents' house that evening with a knot of unease twisting in my stomach. It was one of those rare family gatherings where everyone made an effort to show up dressed to impress, armed with polite small talk that almost felt a little forced. The reason for the meeting? My parents had hinted at discussing the future of their personal estate, a topic that had been lingering unspoken for years. I wasn't holding my breath though. If history had taught me anything, it was that I rarely came out of these situations feeling anything other than sidelined. My sister, Tanya, was already at the center of attention, basking in the glow of everyone's compliments. She wore a smug smile, the kind that hinted she knew something the rest of us didn't. Watching her, I couldn't help but feel the familiar sting of being overshadowed. Tanya had always been my parents' golden child, coddled, praised and excused no matter what. I, on the other hand, had learned early on that hard work and self-reliance were my only allies. The formalities dragged on, and just as I was debating whether sneaking out would be too obvious, my father clinked his glass, calling for attention. My mother stood beside him, her face glowing with an excitement that immediately made me wary. They began their announcement with a flourish, speaking about family legacy and how much they value the future of our bloodline. I listened, my nerves tightening with every word. And then it came, the bombshell. They were handing their entire estate to Tanya. Not half, not even a small share for me, everything. My ears rang as I struggled to process their reasoning. My father said Tanya needed more support because she was the younger sibling, as if her age somehow made her incapable of standing on her own. My mother chimed in, praising Tanya's supposed future plans and how the estate would help her achieve them. Then, almost as an afterthought, they turned to me and said they believed I was independent enough to manage without help. My father even added that I should work harder if I wanted success, as though my years of grinding away had counted for nothing. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I managed to ask why they thought this was fair. My voice was shaky despite my effort to sound calm. My father waved me off, dismissing my concerns with a condescending smile. He said it wasn't about fairness. It was about doing what's best for the family. Tanya, of course, couldn't resist rubbing salt in the wound. She made some snide comments about how she had earned this because of her big plans and how I didn't need the burden of managing the estate. Her tone was syrupy and sweet, but her words were barbed, cutting deeper than I thought possible. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, to tell them how their decision made me feel like an outsider in my own family. But what was the point? They had made up their minds, and no amount of reasoning would change the fact that I had been pushed aside yet again. The rest of the room watched in awkward silence, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to step in. I could see a few sympathetic glances from extended family members, but none of them spoke up. I sat there, stunned and humiliated, while my parents and Tanya basked in their self-congratulatory glow. The room was thick with awkward silence, the kind that followed the bombshell no one saw coming. I was still processing my parents' announcement. Tanya, who was seated across from me, practically glowed with smugness. Her triumph was etched across her face. I wanted to leave, to escape the suffocating tension, but before I could move, my grandpa cleared his throat. It was a small sound, yet it sliced through the tension like a blade. All eyes turned to him. He had been quiet the entire evening, sitting at the far end of the table with what I had assumed was disinterest, but now his expression was sharp, his gaze fixed on my parents with a calm intensity that carried a warning. He said he had heard just about enough. His voice was steady but carried an unmistakable weight. My father attempted to protest, starting to say something about it not being his place, but my grandpa raised a hand, silencing him. He told my father to let him finish and said this charade had gone on long enough. There was a collective murmur of confusion as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. My heart was beating fast. I wasn't entirely sure why. With deliberate movements he scribbled something onto a check and then stood up and walked over to me. He placed it in my trembling hands. He said the check was for me. $2 million. His personal gift. His voice carried through the room with an air of finality. Everybody seemed frozen, and for a moment no one moved or spoke. I stared at the check in disbelief, the weight of the gesture sinking in. Tanya was the first to break the silence. Her voice was shrill as she demanded to know what was going on. She sputtered about fairness, asking why I was getting this money and not her. Grandpa's gaze snapped to her, sharp and unwavering. He told her that if she wanted to talk about fairness, then they should discuss it properly. His words were clipped, filled with a controlled anger that made everyone sit up straighter. He turned to my parents, his voice rising slightly as he addressed them. He said he had spent years watching them coddle Tanya, enabling her selfishness while ignoring all the effort I had put in to make something of myself. My mother flushed red with embarrassment. My father's face twisted with discomfort. They started to mumble something about Tanya being younger and needing more support, but Grandpa cut them off sharply. He said age had nothing to do with it. He called out their blatant favoritism and said this was about character. He gestured towards Tanya and said they had inflated her ego to the point where she thought the world owed her everything. Tanya gasped in disbelief, trying to defend herself. She claimed she had worked hard too, even if no one had noticed. Grandpa fixed her with a glare and asked her to name one thing she had truly worked hard at. He pointed out that all he had seen was her spending their money and making empty promises about plans she never followed through on. He said that if she considered that hard work, then she was more deluded than he thought. My parents tried to interject again, saying they were within their rights to make decisions about their own estate, but Grandpa waved them off. He said they were free to make their decisions and he was free to make his own. He explained that the money was meant for me as a reward for my resilience and integrity, qualities he had always valued but rarely saw acknowledged in this family. Tears stung my eyes, not because of the money but because of the validation. For once someone had recognized my efforts, my struggles, and my worth. Tanya, unable to contain her emotions, slammed her hands on the table demanding that Grandpa explain himself again. She insisted that this was an insult not just to her but to the entire family. She accused him of playing favorites and claimed that I had somehow manipulated him into giving me the money. I felt my face burn with frustration. Manipulation. I had spent years quietly enduring their blatant favoritism, their constant dismissal of my efforts, and now I was the manipulative one? My parents jumped in to support Tanya, their voices rising as they tried to convince Grandpa to reconsider. My father said that rewarding me this way would create unnecessary divisions in the family, while my mother chimed in that Tanya was still young and needed guidance, not punishment. Their words were dripping with hypocrisy. I had had enough. I refused to stay silent. I told them that this so-called division had always existed, but they had ignored it because it suited them. I reminded them how they had belittled me for choosing to work hard, all while praising Tanya for doing nothing. I asked them how they could stand there and accuse me of being greedy when they had just handed their entire estate to her under the pretense of fairness. Tanya shot back, calling me ungrateful and petty, claiming that I was jealous of her success. Success? I laughed bitterly and told her that living off handouts and demanding more wasn't success, it was entitlement. The argument spiraled with Tanya throwing a tantrum, shouting about how unfair life was, how I had always been jealous of her. My parents tried to pin the blame on me for escalating things, saying I should have just been grateful for what I had. That was when Grandpa stepped in again. He raised his voice louder than I'd ever heard it. Silencing the room, he told my parents they had no right to talk about fairness or family unity when they had spent years fostering this toxic dynamic. He reminded Tanya that nothing in life was guaranteed and warned her that her entitlement would be her downfall. His words stung everyone, even me, though for different reasons. As the room fell silent once more, I realized this wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about finally being seen, finally being heard. Tanya, of course, couldn't let it go. She wailed about how unfair it was. She asked if she didn't deserve something too. Grandpa's tone turned icy as he told her she had already been handed everything on a silver platter. Yet she still complained. He said she was lucky he hadn't stripped my parents' inheritance altogether and given it to me instead. The room erupted into chaos. My parents were shouting. Tanya was on the verge of tears and the rest of the family whispered furiously among themselves. Through it all, Grandpa remained calm, his point made. Before he left, he turned to me, placing a firm hand on my shoulder. He told me to use the money wisely and left the room without another word. His exit left a stunned silence in his wake. None of what happened erased the years of neglect or hurt, but I want to keep the check. What should I do? Update 1. A week had passed since that chaotic family gathering and things still felt heavy. It wasn't just the argument that lingered, it was the aftermath. The real impact of everything that had happened. I was still processing the conversation with my parents, the way they had dismissed me like I was nothing, as if all my years of hard work meant nothing compared to my sister's entitlement. It stung. Then one afternoon my grandpa showed up at my door. I wasn't expecting him, but the sight of him there brought a sense of calm I didn't realize I needed. He looked around the living room, taking in the modest space, and then glanced at me almost as if seeing me in the new light. He always had this quiet sophistication about him, never one to get involved in the drama, but this time he wasn't holding back. He came in without saying much, but his presence was solid. Finally, after a moment, he spoke a little softer than usual. He told me he just wanted to check in and see how I was doing after everything that had happened. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that until he said it. I let out a breath, half laughing, half sighing, and told him that I was doing as well as could be expected. It had been tough, of course, but I was managing. I didn't want to dump everything on him, so I kept it brief. I didn't want myself to dwell too much on the hurt that still lingered. He didn't push. He just nodded in understanding. But then he looked at me seriously. He said that he should have stepped in sooner, that he should have called out the way my parents treated me, how they'd always put my sister on a pedestal while overlooking all my efforts. It was hard to hear him say that, but his words were sincere. I told him I hadn't expected him to step in. I'd always known what they were like and I'd made my peace with it, but it still hurt, especially now seeing how little they thought of me. Grandpa nodded again. His expression was soft. He said that I shouldn't let them define my worth anymore, that I had earned every bit of what was coming to me, and then he told me in his quiet way that I didn't need to keep chasing their approval. I had a chance now, a real chance to build something for myself with the money he had given me. He said that I had the power to create my own future and how I used that money was left to my judgment. I asked him though how to move forward, if it was really okay for me to use that money. What if I messed up? What if I didn't know what to do with it? Oh, he smiled at me, not in a condescending way, but with that familiar patient wisdom. He told me not to worry about wasting it and that the important thing was to take my time, think things through and reach out for help when I needed it. He'd be there for me every step of the way, guiding me if I wanted it. We spent a few more hours talking about my options, about investments, about what I could do with the $2 million. He told me to meet with financial advisors, suggested I look into mentoring opportunities and encouraged me to keep learning. It was a lot to process, but I felt lighter as we talked. I wasn't on my own in this. I had someone in my corner and he actually believed in me. As he stood to leave, he put a hand on my shoulder, a rare gesture of affection. He told me he was proud of me, that he always had been and that I should never forget it. Update 2. 4 months had passed and things had certainly changed. My sister, having taken full control of the estate, was already in over her head. I never would have guessed it, but she managed to make a mess of what was supposed to be a smooth transition. It wasn't even that she didn't have the resources. She had everything handed to her on a silver platter. But I guess when everything's given to you, there's no drive to make sure it lasts. First, she decided to liquidate most of the family's assets, claiming it was for some necessary upgrades to the estate. I heard from a cousin that she'd sold off a bunch of antique furniture, stuff that had been in the family for decades, just so she could redecorate. And the renovations, well, she went for the most extravagant, overpriced contractors, promising them the world. They took her money and did half the work. Her own stubbornness had her refusing to hear anyone out when they told her to slow down and actually plan for the future. Meanwhile, the debts started piling up. She didn't even notice when the cash was running low. My parents, of course, were still blind to her failings. They kept defending her, saying she was doing her best and that the family should be more supportive, but honestly I wasn't surprised. Word of what was happening spread fast, not in a dramatic way, but people started talking as they always do. My family's financial troubles started showing up in places they couldn't hide. A few of the business partners had pulled out after hearing about the state of things. Extended family members, the ones who had once admired my parents for their stability, began distancing themselves. They weren't interested in being attached to someone who couldn't even hold their ground. I kept hearing little updates here and there about how she'd made a bad deal with a contractor or how she spent an entire month hiring consultants who only gave vague advice and emptied the bank account in the process. It was embarrassing to watch. I couldn't help but feel a little smug though. I knew she couldn't handle what had been given to her and eventually she'd have to face it. But the real kicker came when I found out my parents had tried to cover up some of the mess by hiding financial documents and pretending everything was still fine. They were already trying to act like nothing had changed, as if the whole world hadn't seen their prized possession crumble. I wasn't there for the fallout. I didn't have to be. I had long walked away from that circus, but I did get the occasional call from relatives asking about the family. Some even offered their condolences about how things had gone south, calling my sister unlucky. The family's reputation wasn't just tarnished, it was in shambles, and in some strange way I found myself almost happy. The people who had dismissed me for so long were now facing the consequences of their own poor decisions and I had nothing to do with it. For a while, I just let it all happen. It wasn't my problem anymore. I had my own life to focus on. And it was better that way. Am I too vengeful for being happy about this? Update 3. Every decision seemed worse than the last, from draining resources on unnecessary luxuries to alienating everyone who could have helped her. I wasn't surprised, but I can't deny my parents' stupidity for still indulging her. What happened next was inevitable. Word got out about the mounting debts, the unpaid but useless contractors, and the disappearing assets. A few more businesses that had been part of the family's portfolio pulled out, refusing to deal with a sinking ship. The phone calls my parents had been avoiding finally came to a head when the creditors started showing up. Bills piled up. The lawyers moved in. I heard all of this secondhand, of course. People I hadn't spoken to in years were happy to share the gossip, and it seemed like every other day there was some new update. But what stuck with me the most wasn't the fall from grace that my family was enduring. It was the call I received from my mother that one evening. I hadn't spoken to her since that night, hadn't even given her the time of day, but there she was calling me like nothing had happened, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. Her voice had that unmistakable tinge of desperation. She told me things were getting bad and that they were working on it, but she didn't ask for help, not right away. Instead, she threw in some half-hearted pleas about how they were trying to fix it all. She didn't need to say much. It was obvious they were on the edge of losing everything. Then the tone shifted just like I knew it would. She shifted the blame as she always did. She tried to make it sound like they just hadn't seen it coming, as if they had been blindsided by their own decisions. "You know, we always thought you'd be there for us," she said, almost trying to guilt-trip me. I stayed silent for a long while, waiting for her to get to the point. Eventually she asked, not so subtly, if I could help. There was a catch, of course. She didn't say please or acknowledge the fact that the whole mess had started because of their poor choices. No, she made it sound like I owe them something now. "You've got the money, don't you? Maybe you could lend a hand to the family." I was angry, but I kept myself in check. I simply hung up. It was better to not engage with trash. I hadn't forgotten what they'd said to me, the things they told me about working harder and earning my own success. I hadn't forgotten how my mother had dismissed me so easily, how my sister had basked in her undeserved victory. And then, as I expected, my sister called. I didn't answer. The voicemail she left was similar, but this time it had a touch of manipulation. She started with an apology claiming she'd been stressed and had made mistakes. She told me how bad things have gotten and begged for me to step in and help save the family from ruin, as it was my responsibility as an elder sister. She even said that the estate was too much for her to handle, that she wasn't prepared and that if I helped her maybe things could be fixed. She was practically begging for the check to get cashed again. I listened to the whole message, the desperation dripping from every word, and when I finally dialed her number back I didn't waste time with pleasantries. She didn't deserve that. I stayed calm, but the disgust in my voice was unmistakable as I asked if she really expected me to help. After everything that had happened, did she honestly think I'd swoop in and fix it all? She stammered, trying to play the family card as always, but I was done listening to that nonsense. She had done nothing but squander everything handed to her, and now she was asking me to bail her out. I reminded her of the words she had used to dismiss me so easily, the words that have stuck with me for so long. She had told me to work harder, that I didn't deserve anything handed to me. Well, now it was her turn and I rubbed that in her face. She tried to interrupt, but I wasn't letting her off that easily. I told her that I had worked my entire life to get where I was and not once had anyone help me. I'd had to fight for everything, especially against her selfishness, entitlement, and all the demands my family had placed on me without resources. And now when it was all falling apart, she thought I was going to fix it for her? No, that wasn't going to happen. She sounded exasperated on the other end of the line, as if she thought she could guilt me into something. She mentioned how I had the money just sitting there like that somehow meant I owed her something. I cut her off before she could go further, telling her exactly what I thought. "You think that means I owe you?" I said. "I'm not your backup plan. I don't owe you anything, and I certainly don't owe you my success." I could practically hear her frustration, but I wasn't done yet. I made it clear that I had made my choice a long time ago, and unlike her, I wasn't about to keep making the same mistakes over and over. I hung up without another word, and I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for her. The calls kept coming. My mother, my sister, even some extended family members, they all had the same story, the same excuses, the same desperate plea for help. They were all looking for someone to take the fall for their failures, but none of them were getting anything from me. I didn't take their calls anymore. I didn't need to. In the end, they won't get a dime from me, not a single cent, and I didn't feel a shred of guilt. Update 4. The room was tense with everyone sitting in a nervous silence. Everybody was glancing awkwardly at each other. The dust hadn't settled from the last family meeting. The family was still reeling from the fallout. My parents had spent the last couple of days pleading with me, trying to play the role of the remorseful victims. They begged for forgiveness, but the words always felt hollow. Then, just as I thought the noise of their requests would become too much to bear, my grandpa called for a family meeting. He hadn't been a part of the chaos in the aftermath of the dinner he had chosen to just observe. Now it was his turn to speak. I saw my parents seated there, still looking somewhat disheveled from the ordeal. I knew this was going to be a conversation none of us would forget. My sister was there too, her face flushed with embarrassment, eyes darting around as if she could make everyone change their minds with just a look. Grandpa stood at the front, tall and commanding as always, his sharp eyes piercing through the tension. Without a word, he took his seat at the head of the table, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something colder, more resolute. I took my seat across from him, not sure what to expect. I had learned by now that nothing with his family was ever straightforward. Grandpa began, his voice cutting through the uneasy silence as he calmly said he was sure we were all wondering why he'd called this meeting. He then added that the time had come for him to set things right. The time for excuses was over. My sister shifted in her seat, crossing her arms tighter as if preparing for a battle. My parents were already looking at each other, exchanging nervous glances. Grandpa continued stating that for too long he had watched my parents make foolish decisions and how my sister was more disappointing than he had anticipated. He admitted that he'd been too passive and too forgiving for far too long, but now that was no longer the case. The words hung in the air, heavy and pointed. It felt like I was holding my breath, unsure of where this was going. Grandpa's voice grew stronger as he declared he had decided to amend his will. He stood taking his time and with a sharp look at my parents told us that their inheritance was now revoked. The words hit with the force that left the room still. My mother's face turned pale and my father's mouth opened though no words came out. Their shock was transparent. My sister's expression twisted in disbelief, her mouth slightly ajar as she glanced from Grandpa to our parents. I knew something big was coming, but I hadn't expected it to happen like this. Grandpa's declaration echoed in the room, reverberating through the silence. My sister, unable to keep her composure any longer, let out a stunned gasp before she blurted out asking how Grandpa could do such a thing. She demanded to know why he was punishing her, claiming she had done nothing wrong. Grandpa didn't hesitate, cutting her off. He coldly stated that she had spent her life acting entitled, believing that everything was owed to her and that my parents had enabled her selfishness. He went on to explain how my parents had fostered a climate where I was constantly forced to prove myself, where my hard work was taken for granted while my sister's demands were always met with indulgence. He then turned to my parents, his eyes narrowing with anger. "You didn't help anyone," he said, his voice low and sharp. "You crippled your daughter with your favoritism and you've set your own daughter up for failure with your selfishness. Now the bill is coming due." My mother was wiping her eyes with a handkerchief, but the tears weren't just from sadness, they were from shame. My father had his hands clenched on the table, his knuckles white as he tried to find the words to defend himself, but Grandpa didn't let him speak, his gaze cutting through the room like a blade. My sister was visibly trembling, her face flushed with humiliation, her mouth working as if she could find some way to undo everything Grandpa had just said, but the words weren't coming. She sat in stunned silence, her gaze darting between Grandpa and me, as if she couldn't believe the turn this conversation had taken. My parents tried to apologize, their voices now trembling. My mother, with tears streaming down her face, whispered how sorry she was, how they never meant to make me feel less than. My father, sounding weak for the first time, muttered about how they never wanted things to go this far. But their apologies felt like empty words because I could see the viciousness in their gaze. They just wanted to regain control over the situation they had created. Everybody knew better than to take sides after that, or they might just be cut out of the will too. 2 days later I received a message from them, a final attempt at trying to gain access to my money. They apologized again, expressing regret for their behavior and asking for forgiveness. But I didn't need to hear it. The words didn't carry the weight they once might have. I had already forgiven them, but that didn't mean I was going to let them back into my life.